Hi guys, wanted to start a new series on favor, so we'll begin that today and let's see how far it goes. Because after last week's teaching on favor, I just realized how little we know about it and how we need to take advantage of this amazing gift that God has given us. And so today I want to start with the idea of approval, which is part of favor. That we are approved of God. And so we'll just discuss favor from the perspective of approval. Because like it or not, we are all approval junkies who on one hand need our lives validated. On the other hand, we are afraid of rejection, and so we spend our lives chasing after approval and or otherwise just find ways to cope with disapproval. And part of the reason we struggle with approval is because of the self-regard we have, and it's a hopeless way of living, because as long as self-regard is important to me, I will always be wondering if you have noticed me, if you have acknowledged me, if you've accepted me, if you've applauded me. And all of us have it, to varying degrees. And it's a hopeless way of living when self-regard is kind of at the center of our lives, and unfortunately it is. And God wants to break us out of this. And the way He breaks us out of it is, one, by teaching us not to have self-regard at the center, not to entrust ourselves to the opinions of men. And you see this in John chapter 2, verse 24, and in Matthew 6, 2, I think. Yeah, where it talks about how Jesus did not entrust Himself to what people thought of Him. And so that's one way He gets rid of our craving for approval. But the other way He does away with our craving for approval and our fear of rejection or disapproval is by helping us step into His unconditional approval. And that's a frightening phrase, unconditional approval. As soon as I say that, our minds start thinking, but that can't be, because there are things that God does not approve of. And so let me just put it this way. God's approval operates on two levels. There is approval that God gives as a reward for things that we obey and do based on what He has prescribed. So that's one kind of approval. But the approval that I want to talk about that makes up favor is the approval that is a result of intrinsic worth and birthright. There's an intrinsic worth to me, and it's a birthright that God has given me. This has nothing to do with rewards, it's a blessing. And that is the approval that makes up the idea of favor. Again, let me remind you what we're trying to accomplish here. We are saying that we need to understand the favor of God. And one of the words that perhaps gives you a picture of what God's favor is like is His approval of you. And this is not how we think, So let me first talk about how there are certain things that God approves when we do stuff. For instance, there's approval that He gives us because of work that we have done. And that's in 2 Corinthians 10:18. Then there is the approval that comes because we handle the word correctly. That's in 2 Timothy 2:15. Then there is the approval that comes because we multiplied the talents He gave us. That's in Matthew 25:21, where He says, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And that's a phrase that approves or acknowledges what you've done. Then there is the approval that comes because He can trust us with kingdom work. And you read that in 1 Thessalonians 2:4 and Romans 14:18, and you can go check these scriptures later. And then there is the approval that comes just because of faith. You read that in Hebrews 11:2. In some versions, it actually says that the men of old were approved for their faith. So these are approvals that come as the result of doing something. And it is part of God's approval. But what I want to talk about today, and what we need to grasp, is this idea of approval that comes because of your intrinsic worth. Approval that comes because it is your birthright. So when we talk about intrinsic worth, why does God approve me? What is it that gives me this amazing intrinsic worth? Guys, to begin with, this is something that just grabs me perhaps the most. Guys, I was his idea. I was God's idea. I, Jacob, am God's idea. He brought me into existence because it was his idea. He brought me into existence because he decided to. He brought me into existence sheerly through his love and his desire to love me. There is worth to me because I am his idea. I'm not the idea of my parents. I'm not the idea of creation of mankind. I, Jacob, am his idea. It gives me such value. And knowing his nature, I can imagine how approving he is of having made me, having shaped me, having formed me, having given me a name, knowing me the way he does. This was his idea. He can't go back on it because he doesn't want to. Even before I was formed, Christ was slain so that my going astray will also be brought back into a place of reconciliation, which then brings me to my second point. Guys, I was approved at my worst in the sacrifice of his son. You read about it in Romans 5 verse 10. That I was approved at my worst. I was approved in the sacrifice of the son 2,000 years ago, or before the foundations of the earth, as you want to look at it, or in 1988 when I responded to the call of God. Choose any time period you want, but I was approved at my worst in the sacrifice of his only begotten, precious, priceless, beloved son. This is what I mean by intrinsic worth and my birthright. I was approved at my worst in the sacrifice of his beloved son. You know, my love worthiness is seen in God's decision to live in me and have no separation. I marvel at that sometimes, that I am so approved and there is such love worthiness, as in a worthiness that comes out of his love for me. My love worthiness is seen in God's decision, in Alpha and Omega's decision to live in me forever and have no separation. He does not want to be separate from me. He does not want to have any filament or filter separating him and me. You read about it in Colossians 1:27. There is no separation between his spirit and my spirit. He lives in me by his spirit. Even when I sin, there is no separation now between him and me, which is why he bears the collision of my sin and bears the grief of my sin, because there is no separation. This is the degree of approval. And all this happens the moment I get born again. He begins to live in me. And he knows everything that's going to happen in the future. But he approves me to the point where he decides that there will be no separation between Jacob and I. And that I have made a decision to live in him even though I know everything about him. His approval surrounds me with His goodness every day, even before I have a chance to do good. When I wake up in the morning, I need to grasp that His approval is upon me and that His goodness is around me even before I have a chance to do any good. Guys, this is a gift that God gives. But it is a gift in my life only when I, as a recipient, accept it. Approval allows me to experience the pleasure of God. Approval allows me to experience the pleasure of God. I shift from striving to please Him to living for His pleasure. Let me say that again. Being aware of this approval, which is my birthright and comes out of the intrinsic worth that He has bestowed upon me and upon you. This approval allows me to now feel the pleasure of God, as in it's the same thing a child feels, having done nothing and unaware of what is going to happen through the day. The child knows the approval of its parent from the moment it wakes up and even before it wakes up. Approval allows me to experience the pleasure of God. And when I wake up with that sense, when I know that this is what is upon me, I shift from striving to please Him, bearing the shame and the guilt and the blame of failing. I move from striving to please Him to now running and living for His pleasure, because His approval causes me to respond to running for Him. I hope you grasp it. I hope I grasp it. Yeah? Bless you.